It was just another routine flight for Rick Harrison, the star of the famous TV show Pawn Stars, as he boarded his private jet. Flying had become a normal part of his life, whether he was traveling to his next big business meeting, making an appearance for a show, or just taking some time to relax away from the public eye. To the outside world, Rick was the face of success, a man who had built a thriving business and earned the respect of many, but that all changed when the FBI stepped onto his plane. The jet, which had always been a symbol of Rick's success and luxury, now became the focus of an investigation that no one had expected. No one knew what was about to unfold. The FBI, known for its high-profile cases, rarely deals with celebrities in such a manner, especially someone as well-known as Rick. So when the news broke that the FBI had boarded his private jet, curiosity was at an all-time high. What could possibly be inside his plane that would lead the authorities to get involved? As the FBI agents walked onto the jet, their purpose was clear. They weren't there for a routine check. Something serious was happening. The private jet, once seen as a symbol of Rick's wealth and success, now held an air of mystery. People couldn't help but wonder why the FBI was involved. What had they found? Was Rick in trouble? Or was this all just a big misunderstanding? These were the questions on everyone's minds, and with each passing minute, the tension only grew stronger. At first, no one knew the specifics of what was going on. Rick, shocked by the sudden turn of events, couldn't believe what was happening. He had always been someone who prided himself on doing things the right way. But now, here he was, caught in the middle of a high-profile investigation that seemed to be unfolding in front of the entire world. The media, quick to latch on to any juicy story, began speculating immediately. What could the FBI have possibly found on his jet? People started to assume the worst, and the media attention only grew more intense with each passing hour. Rick's mind raced. His private jet had always been a space where he could escape from the pressure of his public life. It was a place where he could relax and enjoy his success. Now it was a scene of uncertainty and anxiety. How could this happen to him? What was going on? Was his reputation in jeopardy? These were the questions that Rick was left to grapple with as the FBI agents went through his plane with a fine-tooth comb. The investigation quickly became a topic of discussion for the public. Fans of Pawn Stars and people who had followed Rick's career for years were suddenly left wondering if they had been wrong about him. What had he been hiding? How could someone who had always been portrayed as a trustworthy businessman end up at the center of such a serious investigation? The public's reaction was a mix of disbelief and curiosity. Everyone wanted to know what the FBI had found, but no one seemed to have the answers. As Rick sat there waiting for answers, the unknowns about the investigation began to create a sense of tension. The more the media speculated, the more Rick's life seemed to spiral out of control. The idea that something hidden could be uncovered on his private jet seemed almost unbelievable. But the FBI's involvement made it clear that whatever was found was serious. It was no longer just a question of what if, but a question of what now. Rick wasn't the kind of person who usually let things get to him, but this was different. He had built his career on trust and integrity. He had built a reputation as someone who worked hard and played by the rules. Now it felt like that foundation was crumbling beneath him. What had happened to the life he had worked so hard to build? Could everything be lost over something he didn't even understand? These were the thoughts that were consuming him as he waited for the investigation to unfold. The mystery surrounding the FBI's actions created a sense of suspense. Why had they chosen Rick's private jet? What did they believe they would find? And why was the situation being treated so seriously? The unanswered questions only made the whole situation feel more intense. Was there something Rick hadn't known about his own jet? Or was he being wrongly implicated in something he had no control over? The curiosity around the situation was overwhelming, and the tension built with each moment that passed. As the hours went on, speculation continued to rise. The public's curiosity about what had been discovered in Rick's private jet reached a fever pitch. People were eager to know what the FBI had uncovered. Was it something illegal? Was it connected to his business, or something entirely different? The possibilities seemed endless, and no one could figure out which one was true. For Rick, the uncertainty was unbearable. He had to wonder, had the life he knew been built on a lie? Or was this all just a big misunderstanding? Could the FBI find something that would change everything he thought he knew about himself? The media frenzy began, with reporters from all corners of the world trying to get answers. Every detail about the investigation was scrutinized, and Rick's name was on everyone's lips. The story became bigger by the minute. What had been found? The public demanded answers, but no one was willing to speak about the findings just yet. This only added to the curiosity and suspense, keeping everyone on edge. The FBI was keeping its cards close to its chest, and Rick had no idea what was coming next. Rick's life, which had once seemed so secure, was now teetering on the edge. What had happened? Was this the end of his career? Or could he somehow salvage his reputation? The questions seemed endless, and for Rick the uncertainty was suffocating. His mind raced, but there was nothing he could do but wait. The investigation had already begun, and no matter what, his life would never be the same again. In the end, the discovery made by the FBI was something that would change everything for Rick Harrison. It was a moment that would go down in history, and one that no one could have predicted. For Rick, it was the beginning of a new chapter, one filled with uncertainty and the need to rebuild his life. The hook, curiosity and suspense were only just beginning to unfold, and everyone would have to wait to see how the story would develop. What had the FBI uncovered on that private jet, and how would it change Rick Harrison's future forever? When the FBI started its investigation into Rick Harrison's private jet, no one could have predicted the shockwaves that would follow. The agency's involvement immediately raised questions. What was so important that the FBI had to be called in? Rick, who had always maintained a strong, trustworthy image as the face of Pawn Stars, suddenly found himself in the middle of a situation that seemed unreal. He had built his career on being straightforward and dependable, but now he was facing something completely unexpected. The FBI, known for investigating high-level crimes, wasn't involved in celebrity drama. So what could have led them to his private jet? At first, the investigation seemed mysterious and surreal. Rick had no idea why the FBI would even be interested in his jet. He had done nothing wrong that he could think of, but as the agents moved through the plane, checking every corner and asking questions, Rick started to feel the weight of the situation. He had always been the kind of person who stayed out of trouble, someone who focused on his business and personal life. But now, his name was associated with a criminal investigation, and the uncertainty was unsettling. What could they have found? Was it possible that someone had placed something on his plane without his knowledge? The thought was troubling, and it made Rick wonder if he had missed something along the way. The FBI didn't just show up out of nowhere. Their investigation had been carefully planned, and they were clearly looking for something specific. But what could it be? As the agents continued their search, Rick found himself growing more anxious. This wasn't just about a random check or a misunderstanding. The level of scrutiny the FBI was applying suggested that they were dealing with something significant. And that only raised more questions. What were they looking for? Why were they so focused on Rick's private jet? Was this about something that happened a long time ago, or was there something more recent that had brought the FBI to his door? For Rick, the next few hours were filled with uncertainty. He tried to remain calm, but the situation felt like it was slipping out of his control. The FBI agents worked methodically, examining everything from the plane's compartments to its cargo. But no one was saying anything. They didn't need to, because the more they searched, the more the tension in the air grew. Rick couldn't help but wonder what they had found. What had been hidden away in the corners of his jet? Was there something he hadn't noticed before? Or was he being implicated in something bigger than he could imagine? The media had already caught wind of the situation, and soon everyone was talking about it. The headlines were everywhere, and the public couldn't get enough. People were curious, eager to know what was going on. Why would the FBI target someone like Rick Harrison? What had they discovered on his private jet? The speculation started almost immediately. Some said it was about money laundering. Others suggested it might be related to smuggling. But no one knew for sure. Everyone was just guessing. And that made the whole situation even more intriguing. Rick's life, which had once been about finding rare antiques and running a successful business, was now the subject of national interest. The pressure was building, and the questions were growing louder. What did the FBI know that the rest of us didn't? Rick could only watch as the investigation unfolded. He wanted answers, but he couldn't get any. The FBI wasn't saying anything to the press, and they weren't giving him any details. They were being tight-lipped, which only added to the mystery. Every moment that passed without any explanation only fueled the public's curiosity. People were fascinated by the idea that something big was happening behind the scenes, but no one could figure out exactly what it was. The longer the investigation continued, the more Rick began to question everything. Could there be something in his past that was catching up with him now, or was this all just a case of bad luck? The idea that the FBI had found something on his jet made him feel like he was in the middle of a nightmare he couldn't wake up from. He had always been in control of his life and business, but now he felt completely powerless. The unknowns were overwhelming. What if he had missed something? What if someone had planted evidence to frame him? The questions just kept coming, and with each one the sense of dread deepened. But the real question remained. What had the FBI discovered? Rick knew that whatever it was, it had to be serious. The agents didn't show up for no reason, and they didn't search his jet like that, unless they had a good reason to believe there was something to find. As the investigation continued, Rick started to realize that his life was no longer just about running a pawn shop or appearing on TV. This investigation had the potential to change everything for him. And the worst part was, he had no idea how long this would last. Would it drag on for days, weeks, or months? What if the FBI found something that would forever change the way people saw him? The media frenzy didn't help. Every report added to the uncertainty, and every new detail seemed to make the situation worse. People on social media were quick to judge, and rumors were flying in every direction. Some people believed Rick was hiding something, while others thought the whole thing was a setup. There were those who believed in his innocence, but even they were left wondering what was really going on. The more time passed, the more Rick's reputation hung in the balance. He had worked so hard to build a life that others admired, but now it all seemed to be at risk. The mystery deepened with each new development. As the FBI's investigation dragged on, it became clear that this wasn't just about one small discovery, it was about something much bigger. Rick's mind raced as he tried to figure out what had happened. Was he being targeted for something he didn't even understand? Or had he unknowingly become involved in something much darker? As the FBI continued their search, the pressure mounted, and the questions remained unanswered. Rick was left to wonder what was the truth, and how would it change everything for him. Every day that passed without an explanation only made the situation more intense. The suspense grew, and people began to speculate more and more. Was Rick Harrison really the man everyone thought he was? Or was there something much more complex beneath the surface? As the investigation continued, the answers that Rick desperately needed seemed to be just out of reach. The curiosity was overwhelming, and the only thing that was certain was that nothing would ever be the same again. When Rick Harrison first learned about the FBI's involvement and the investigation into his private jet, he could hardly believe it. He had always prided himself on his ability to stay calm under pressure, to think things through and make decisions that were logical and well-reasoned. But this was different. This wasn't just another challenge to overcome in business, this was something much more serious. The FBI was involved, and that meant something major had happened. Something he hadn't expected, and something that could change his entire life. As soon as Rick heard that the FBI was searching his jet, his mind began to race. How could this be happening? He had never been in trouble with the law, and he had always done things by the book. He couldn't imagine what the FBI could have found on his private jet that would cause such a big stir. The thought alone was unsettling. He had spent years building his reputation as a trustworthy businessman and a reliable television personality. Now everything he had worked for seemed to be hanging by a thread. The situation was surreal. It felt like a bad dream, something he would wake up from any minute. But it wasn't a dream, it was real. The moment the news hit him, Rick felt his world start to shift. He had always been in control of his career, his business, and his public image. But now he was facing something he couldn't control. The FBI was involved, and they were looking for something. But what? What could possibly be hidden on his jet? He had flown countless times, and his jet had always been a place where he could escape from the pressures of the world. Now it felt like that safe haven had turned into a place of uncertainty. The more he thought about it, the more his anxiety grew. What made the situation even more shocking was the fact that Rick had always been the kind of person who stayed out of trouble. He had no history of criminal behavior, and he wasn't involved in any shady dealings. His life had been about hard work and building a successful business. So why was the FBI showing up now? What was it that they had found? It didn't make sense. Rick's mind was filled with questions. He tried to calm himself, telling himself that this was just a misunderstanding, but deep down he couldn't shake the feeling that something bigger was at play. As the investigation continued, Rick's sense of helplessness began to grow. The FBI wasn't offering any answers, and the media was relentless. Every new report made the situation feel more real and more serious. People began to question his integrity, and even those who had been his biggest supporters started to wonder if there was more to the story than they had ever known. The mystery surrounding the FBI's search only made things worse. Rick could sense the curiosity growing in the public, and with every passing moment the pressure on him intensified. He had to wonder, had his reputation already been ruined? Was there any way to clear his name? Rick's reaction to the whole ordeal was a mix of disbelief, frustration, and fear. He had built his career on being straightforward and honest. He had always been open with the public, letting them see the man behind the TV persona. But now that persona was being questioned. The idea that something could have been hidden on his private jet made Rick feel like he didn't even know his own life anymore. The thought that someone could have planted something there without his knowledge made him feel betrayed. How could something like this happen? And who could be behind it? At the same time, Rick was struggling with the feeling of being powerless. He had always prided himself on being in control of his business and his life. He had worked hard to get to where he was, and now it seemed like all of that was being threatened by something he didn't understand. He had no answers. The FBI wasn't saying anything to him directly, and the media was only fueling the fire. The more he thought about it, the more he felt like he was spiraling. His life, which had once felt so stable, now felt like it was completely out of control. The hardest part for Rick wasn't the investigation itself, it was the uncertainty. He had no idea what the FBI had found or why they were interested in his private jet. The mystery surrounding the situation was overwhelming. Every new report only added more questions. Was he being framed? Was this something from his past that had come back to haunt him, or was there something more sinister at play? The possibilities seemed endless, and each one made Rick feel more and more uncertain about his future. As the investigation went on, Rick found himself struggling with a sense of isolation. He was used to being in the public eye, but this was different. This wasn't just a story about his business or his TV show. This was about his personal life, his integrity, and his reputation. People were starting to look at him differently. The public's perception of him was shifting. They were no longer just seeing him as the star of Pawn Stars. They were seeing him as someone under investigation, someone who might not be as trustworthy as they had once believed. The more Rick thought about the situation, the more he realized that his entire life could be changed by whatever the FBI had discovered. His business, his personal relationships, and his future were all at risk. Could he ever rebuild his reputation? Would people still trust him after all of this? The questions seemed to be piling up, and Rick couldn't find any answers. It was as if everything he had worked for was slipping away, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. Through it all, the suspense remained. The FBI hadn't revealed anything, and the public was left in the dark, eagerly waiting for answers. What had they found on Rick's jet? What was the truth behind the investigation? Everyone seemed to have their own theories, but no one knew for sure. The mystery deepened with each passing day, and Rick found himself caught in the middle of something that was completely beyond his control. In the end, Rick's shocked reaction was a mix of disbelief and fear. He had built his career on trust, hard work, and dedication. But now all of that was being questioned. As the investigation continued, the public's curiosity grew. What had the FBI found, and how would it change Rick's life forever? The questions remained unanswered, and the tension in the air only grew stronger. For Rick, the road ahead was uncertain, and the weight of the situation was starting to feel unbearable. When the FBI's investigation into Rick Harrison's private jet began to unfold, no one could have predicted what was about to be revealed. It was a moment that would change everything for Rick and anyone who had been following the story. Up until now, the investigation had been shrouded in mystery, with the public left in the dark about the details. But as the FBI's work continued, the truth began to emerge. What they found on that jet was far more shocking than anyone could have imagined. Rick, who had once been a symbol of trustworthiness, now found himself facing questions that he could not answer. The FBI's search revealed things that no one expected, and those revelations would ultimately cause a huge stir. It was clear that the investigation wasn't about a simple misunderstanding. There was something much bigger going on, but what could it be? Rick's private jet, a place where he thought he was safe from the world's eyes, had become the center of a criminal investigation. As the FBI began to piece together the information they had gathered, the revelations started to leak out. The public, already captivated by the mystery of the investigation, was now being given small glimpses into what had been found. Each new piece of information sent shockwaves through the media. People were glued to their screens, waiting to hear what the FBI had discovered. And with each new detail, the mystery deepened. Rick, meanwhile, was left in a state of disbelief. How could this have happened? He had no idea what the FBI was finding, and the more he heard, the more confused and worried he became. He had always been careful about his business dealings and personal life. He had never done anything that would warrant an FBI investigation, so why was this happening to him? What had the FBI uncovered that had made this case so serious? The revelations were shocking, not just to Rick, but to everyone who had been following the story. People had speculated about what the FBI might find, but no one could have guessed the truth. The details of the investigation slowly started to surface, and they painted a picture of a much more complex situation than anyone had realized. It was clear that this was not just about a simple misunderstanding or a mistake. The FBI had uncovered something significant, something that was linked to Rick in a way no one could have predicted. The public's curiosity only grew with each new piece of information. People were dying to know what the FBI had found, and the media was all too happy to feed the frenzy. Every report seemed to reveal something more shocking, something more unsettling. What had Rick been involved in? Was there something he was hiding? Or was he simply the victim of a misunderstanding, a pawn in a much larger game? As the details of the investigation became clearer, it became evident that Rick's life was about to be turned upside down. The revelations were not just about his private jet or his business. They went deeper than that. There were connections that no one had seen coming, and those connections were about to change the way people saw Rick Harrison forever. He was no longer just the star of Pawn Stars. He was someone under investigation, someone whose life was now filled with questions and uncertainty. For Rick, the hardest part was not knowing what would happen next. The FBI had found something, but they weren't revealing everything. The public was left to speculate, and that only added to the pressure Rick was feeling. He had always been a man of answers, someone who could take control of any situation, but now he was helpless. The more the investigation continued, the more Rick felt like he was losing control of his own life. The revelations kept coming, and each one seemed to raise more questions than it answered. The investigation was no longer just about the search of a private jet. It had become something much bigger. The FBI was uncovering details that linked Rick to a much larger mystery, and no one knew what the final outcome would be. Was he being framed, or was there something deeper going on that no one had seen before? The curiosity was palpable, and every new revelation added fuel to the fire. For Rick, the weight of the situation was overwhelming. He had always prided himself on being a straightforward, honest businessman. But now his reputation was on the line. The public was watching, and they were waiting for answers, but those answers weren't coming easily. The FBI's investigation was ongoing, and each new revelation seemed to deepen the mystery. The truth about what the FBI had found on Rick's private jet would soon come to light, but the journey to that point was filled with suspense and uncertainty. As the investigation continued, Rick found himself in a state of constant anxiety. He had no idea what the final outcome would be, but he knew that his life was never going to be the same again. Whatever the FBI had uncovered, it was something that would change the way the world saw him. With each new revelation, the public's curiosity grew. People wanted to know what had happened, and they wanted to know what the FBI had found. The media coverage only added to the intensity, with each report adding new details and fueling the speculation. The mystery was far from over, and Rick found himself at the center of it all. His life, once so stable, was now in turmoil. He couldn't predict what would happen next, but he knew that whatever it was, it would change everything. As the investigation continued, Rick found himself in a race against time. The truth was out there, and the FBI was determined to uncover it. But what would that truth mean for Rick? Would he be able to clear his name, or had the revelations already done irreparable damage to his reputation? The suspense was unbearable, and the curiosity only grew stronger. Everyone was waiting for the next big reveal, the next shocking detail that would turn the case on its head. In the end, the FBI's investigation into Rick Harrison's private jet was more than just a criminal inquiry. It was a journey into the unknown, a journey that would uncover secrets and reveal the true nature of a man who had spent years in the public eye. What the FBI discovered would change everything for Rick, and the public was ready to learn the truth. The question was, would Rick's life ever be the same again? As the investigation into Rick Harrison's private jet continued, the public's reaction became a story of its own. What had started as a quiet investigation by the FBI quickly turned into a media frenzy. News outlets couldn't get enough of the drama. Everyone seemed to have their own opinion about Rick and the FBI's actions, and the more the story unfolded, the more divided the public became. Some people stood by Rick, believing that there must be some mistake, while others were quick to judge, assuming that the investigation meant he was guilty of something serious. The tension in the air was thick, and everyone seemed to be watching, waiting for the next development. Rick, who had built his career on trust and reliability, was now in the middle of a storm. It wasn't just the FBI's investigation that was making headlines, it was the public's response to it. People loved to speculate, and with every new piece of information their curiosity grew, the questions multiplied. What was the FBI really looking for? What had Rick done, or had he done anything at all? As each new report came out, the public's opinion shifted, and Rick found himself under a microscope like never before. The media, of course, didn't help. With every breaking story, the curiosity only deepened. They painted pictures of Rick as a man who had been hiding something, as someone whose life had been a carefully constructed lie. The idea that a celebrity could have a dark side was enough to captivate the audience. People began to wonder if the man they saw on Pawn Stars was the same man they were hearing about in the news. Could Rick really be hiding something, or was he just the victim of a high-profile mistake? The public was fascinated, and the more they heard, the more they couldn't wait for the truth to come out. For Rick, the situation was even more frustrating because he couldn't control the narrative. The public was being fed small bits of information, but no one really knew the full story. Rick was left to watch as the media spun theories and speculations. It seemed like everyone had an opinion, but no one had all the facts. He had always been someone who liked to have the answers, but in this case he was powerless. The more the public reacted, the more pressure he felt. The uncertainty about what was going to happen next was unbearable. And yet the curiosity continued to grow. Everyone wanted to know what had really happened. Was Rick guilty? Was he hiding something? The public was eating up every new development, but the truth was still locked away. The FBI wasn't revealing anything, and so the public was left to piece together their own version of events. With each new headline, the story became more sensational, and the speculation became wilder. It was as if the media had created a narrative that no one could escape from. Rick was now more than just a TV star. He was the subject of a national mystery. This wasn't just about Rick anymore. It was about something bigger. People were invested in the story because it was unfolding in real time. They wanted to know how it would end. Would Rick's life be destroyed by this investigation, or would he emerge unscathed? It was a story that seemed to have no clear answers, and that only made the public more intrigued. The media didn't help, of course. They fanned the flames of speculation, keeping the story alive and pushing it further into the spotlight. Rick, however, was starting to feel like a pawn in this larger game. The public was more interested in the drama than in the truth. They wanted to know the secrets, the hidden details, and the things that no one had told them yet. They were captivated by the idea that someone like Rick, who had been so open about his life on television, could have been hiding something this big. The fact that the FBI was involved only added to the mystery. What had they found on that private jet? Why were they investigating him? The questions kept piling up, and the media didn't seem to be interested in offering any clear answers. Instead, they were content to fuel the fire, knowing that the public's curiosity would keep the story alive. For Rick, the frustration wasn't just about being misunderstood, it was about the fact that he couldn't set the record straight. He couldn't speak out fully because the investigation was still ongoing, and anything he said could potentially hurt his case. He was stuck in limbo, caught between a public that was eager for answers and a situation that was completely out of his control. The more the media speculated, the more his reputation was at risk. It didn't matter that he had never done anything wrong. The public was already making up their minds, and the damage to his image was being done. As the investigation dragged on, Rick's life became a subject of public fascination. People weren't just curious about the facts, they were curious about his emotions. They wanted to know how he was handling the pressure. Was he scared? Was he angry? Did he feel betrayed? Every time he appeared in public, the cameras were on him, capturing every moment. His every move was now being scrutinized. The public reaction was turning into a circus, and Rick was at the center of it all. The more people talked, the more the story seemed to grow. The pressure on Rick was immense. Not only did he have to deal with the FBI's investigation, but he also had to contend with the constant media attention. Everywhere he went, people were whispering. Every time he appeared on television or in public, the cameras were on him, trying to capture a glimpse of how he was handling the stress. It was as if his entire life was now being viewed through a lens of suspicion, and there was nothing he could do to change that. At the same time, the curiosity of the public continued to grow. What had the FBI found? What secrets was Rick hiding? People were hooked on the story, and they were waiting for the next piece of the puzzle to fall into place. Each new report, each new leak, seemed to add more fuel to the fire. The questions kept coming, and the answers remained elusive. Rick had never been more vulnerable. The public reaction was a constant reminder of how quickly things could change. One minute, he was a respected businessman and television personality, and the next he was at the center of a nationwide scandal. The truth, however, remained just out of reach. The public could only speculate, and that speculation was keeping the story alive. The curiosity was insatiable, and it was clear that this was a story that would continue to unfold for weeks, if not longer. For Rick, it was a nightmare he couldn't wake up from. His reputation, his future, and his personal life were now all hanging in the balance. And the public, eager for answers, was watching his every move. They didn't know the truth yet, but they were waiting. As the investigation into Rick Harrison's private jet continued to unfold, the fallout from the situation became even more intense. Rick's life, which had once seemed stable and predictable, was now in chaos. The investigation and the public's constant speculation were taking a toll on him. What had once been a successful career in the pawn business and a beloved television show was now clouded by questions, rumors, and uncertainty. The fallout from the FBI's search of his private jet would not just affect his career, it would shake the very foundation of his personal life as well. People who had once admired him were now questioning his integrity. The trust he had built over the years seemed to be slipping away with each passing day. The media continued to report on the investigation, each new story adding another layer of tension and confusion. It seemed that no matter what Rick did, he couldn't escape the shadow of the investigation. As the public continued to watch, his every move became scrutinized. It wasn't just about the jet anymore, it was about Rick himself. What kind of person was he? Was he the trustworthy businessman everyone had thought he was, or was there something darker lurking beneath the surface? The fallout was also being felt by Rick's family and friends. They too were caught up in the public's fascination with the story. No one had been prepared for this. They had all watched Rick build his career and his reputation, but now it seemed that all of that could be lost in an instant. People who had once supported Rick were now wondering whether they had been wrong about him. His family had to deal with the constant media attention, the phone calls, and the questions. It was a burden they never expected to carry. The pressure was mounting on everyone involved, and then there was the effect on Rick's business. His reputation as a trustworthy businessman had been central to his success. The public's perception of him had always been crucial to his brand, but now that brand was under attack. People began to wonder whether they could still trust the man they had seen on Pawn Stars for so many years. The uncertainty around the investigation made it harder for Rick to maintain his business relationships. The fallout wasn't just personal, it was professional as well. His name, once synonymous with success, was now being questioned by many. Even those who had done business with him in the past began to distance themselves. Could they afford to continue their relationship with Rick in light of the ongoing investigation? The curiosity surrounding the investigation only grew stronger as more details emerged. Every time the media reported something new, the public's imagination ran wild. People began to speculate about what the FBI had found on that private jet. Was Rick involved in something illegal? Had he been hiding something for years? The questions didn't stop, and as the investigation continued, the fallout deepened. The public's curiosity was insatiable. They wanted answers, and they wanted them now, but Rick was in no position to provide them. The FBI had made sure of that. All he could do was watch as the situation spiraled out of control. For Rick, the hardest part of the fallout was the feeling of helplessness. He had always prided himself on his ability to handle any situation, but now he found himself unable to do anything. The more the investigation dragged on, the more his life was out of his hands. The media was painting a picture of him that didn't feel right, but he had no way to stop it. The more he tried to fight back, the more the public seemed to turn against him. The fallout from the investigation wasn't just about the FBI's findings, it was about how the public saw him now. The damage to his reputation was already done. Even if the FBI cleared him of any wrongdoing, the public would always remember the investigation. The story of Rick Harrison and the FBI's search of his private jet had become too big to ignore. No matter how the investigation ended, Rick's life would never be the same. The questions about his character and his integrity would follow him for years to come. The fallout from the investigation had already begun, and it wasn't just about what the FBI found, it was about how the story had changed the way people saw Rick. As the weeks went on, Rick began to see the full extent of the fallout. His once successful business was now struggling. The customers who had once trusted him were now skeptical. His name had been dragged through the mud, and the damage to his public image was profound. The curiosity about the investigation had shifted into something darker. People no longer just wanted to know the facts, they wanted to see Rick brought down. The story had become a sensation, a drama that played out in the public eye, and Rick was the main character in that drama. The emotional toll on Rick was also becoming more apparent. He was a man who had built his career on hard work and honesty, but now it seemed like all of that was being questioned. The public's opinion of him was changing rapidly, and he felt powerless to stop it. He had no control over the investigation, and he had no control over how the public was reacting to it. It was as if he had lost everything that mattered, his reputation, his business, and even his sense of self. For Rick's family, the fallout was also devastating. They had always supported him, but now they found themselves struggling with the constant media attention and the pressure from the public. They didn't know what to believe anymore. Was Rick really the man they thought he was, or had they all been blinded by his fame? They had to live with the fallout too. The media stories, the rumors, and the constant questioning all took a toll on them. It wasn't just Rick who was affected, it was everyone around him. And yet through all of this, the curiosity about the investigation never stopped. The public's fascination with Rick's story continued to grow, even as the fallout deepened. People wanted to know what the FBI had found. They wanted to know if Rick would be charged with something. They wanted to see how the story would end. But for Rick, the ending was still unclear. No matter what happened next, the damage had been done. The fallout from the investigation would stay with him for the rest of his life. The questions would never stop. Even if Rick was cleared of any wrongdoing, the public would always remember the investigation. They would always remember the way his life had been turned upside down. The curiosity would remain, and the story of Rick Harrison's private jet would live on in the public's mind.